acronym stand for? Years ago, I was in a Rotary Club in the Bay Area, and there was a very interesting member who I got to know a bit. His name was Jock. He was a short, balding, hunched-over guy from Europe. He had this kind of French accent. I don't think he was from France, but he had this kind of French accent. And he kind of had a constant scowl on his face and a sense of always kind of almost being annoyed. And his answers to questions tended to be kind of short and hard to engage. But if you got him talking about his profession, the thing he loved to do, he could talk forever. He was an antique restorer. He was one of those guys that would sit at his workbench surrounded by glue and paint and solvent and with this light blaring at him and restore things that people brought to him that we would look at them in a garage sale and say, I'm not going to pay $1 for that. But people would bring these things to them, and sometimes they were just very sentimental and needed repair. Sometimes they were actually quite valuable and had great, interesting historical stories before them. He would sometimes sit there hunched over this workbench for a couple of days working on these projects. And when he was doing that, he was in his element. He loved it. I remember watching him once, and he was repairing it, the dance of his hands as they went from one thing to another, and he was a master craftsman, and he loved what he did. And he would take this dirty, grimy, paint-encrusted, rusty thing that looked like a pile of junk sometimes. And after working his magic, it would be sometimes just really beautiful. And you could oftentimes, usually actually, after he buffed it all out, you could see what the original creator had invested into this object. And he loved just being able to be a part of bringing that out again. And that was his joy, rediscovering beauty and recovering it. That story of my friend Jock is the story that Zephaniah tells today. So we hear Zephaniah describe a people who have become like overlookable junk at garage sales. This is God's people. There was a time when they walked through the Red Sea and they got the commandments of Sinai and they were thrilled to have a God who cared about them and cared for them. And now this great kingdom of David has fallen into just a mess. They're gross. The northern tribes, what became the country of Israel, have been drug off to Syria. They're gone. Nobody ever knows what happened to them. The south has been reduced just as city of Jerusalem, where actually our anthropologists, those people who dig up artifacts, have found more gods to Baal or statues to Baal and other gods than to Yahweh. And this group of people who had once been God's prized possession are now just a belligerent, self-serving, rebellious group of people. And God responds to that. He says, okay, you want to do that? You want to be that way? Go ahead. He doesn't slap them. He doesn't crush them. He just says, I will let you live that way. If you want to walk away from me, you may. And he does. And he watches their enemies position themselves so that a few years later, the rest of Jerusalem is drug away into a kingdom. The people are miserable. And God sees this happening, and he sees how miserable they are in that process, and he sees it's going to happen. And he says to them, as miserable as it is, there is still hope. Don't doubt that. And that is the message that Zephaniah has for them today. Zephaniah says, fear not, O Zion. Zion being God's people. Fear not, O God's people. Let not your hands grow weak. For the Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice with you over, he will rejoice over you with gladness, and he will quiet you with his love. And he will exalt you with loud singing. He says, I am a God of hope. I am not going anywhere. And if you trust in me, you and your children and your children's children will have a place with me, and you can live in that hope. I am going to wipe that grime and rust off you, and you will be returned to the original beautiful state that I made you in. Hold on to that hope, because I love restoring my people. That is the God that Zephaniah is describing today, because he is a God who is filled with joy when he restores his people. He's a God who's filled with joy when he brings them back from being away from them. He is a God who sings while he restores us. You know that feeling of restoration? Have you ever walked into your kitchen and it's a disaster, and you spend half an hour and you clean it up, and it's like, yeah, before the kids come in and destroy it again. There's this moment. Or maybe there's that project. I think you needed to fix at home and you haven't done it yet. Finally you do it and it's fixed. Or maybe you know what it's like when your car is filthy and you take it to the car wash and it's all clean and it even smells better and it just drives better, doesn't it? That's how God feels as he restores us. He loves doing that. It gives him joy to do that. A wise man once said that we are like the God we worship. If we worship a God who is a grumpy old man because he has all these sinners he has to look over, we will become grumpy. But if we see who our God really is, that he is a God of joy, that he is a God who celebrates the fact that his people are forgiven, then we see our God for who he really is. That is why we light the pink candle, because our God does celebrate who we are. We are forgiven people that are restored. A number of years ago, there was a Presbyterian congregation in Omaha. Nobody here's from Omaha. Anybody here from Nebraska? A couple of other people in our other service from Nebraska. So people in Nebraska are a little different. And Presbyterians can be a little bit different. And I used to be a Presbyterian for 11 years, so I can say that. Presbyterians will tend to be a little bit more less expressive than some of our other Christian brothers and sisters. In fact, here's a story. When Mary and I, we were in the Presbyterian Church for 11 years. When we'd have bulletins, this always cracked Mary up, but we had bulletins, and when something really good would happen, you don't clap, but everybody would take their bulletin and go. I don't know why, it's just less joy-filled than clapping. So anyway, so Presbyterians tend to be a little bit less expressive. There was this congregation in Omaha, And the pastor said, I'm going to address it. So he handed out helium balloons to everybody who came into church that day. And he said, hold on to your helium balloon. And during the service, when you are feeling joyful, let your balloon go. So they had this service, and they sang, and they prayed, and do other things that Presbyterians do, which is a little different than ours, but a little less liturgical, but still great. And a balloon would go up here, a balloon would go up there, a balloon would go up there. And then the service came to an end. And a third of the people were still holding on to their balloons. They didn't get it. They were looking at a God who is grumpy. And they didn't get the joy. That is not the God we worship today. That is not the God we wait for for Christmas. That is not why we lit the pink candle we lit. So this is a season to celebrate who our Lord is, really. He is a Lord of joy. So let your balloon go. In Jesus' name.